Today, you will hear the testimony of Abdullah Al-Rahim, heir to one of the most powerful families in Qatar. He grew up surrounded by luxury, Islamic faith, and duty. But everything changed on a silent dawn, kneeling on the scorching desert sand with a rifle pointed at his head as he watched his life and eternity reduced to a single breath. What no one could have imagined is that this entire journey began in the most unlikely way, with a video by Charlie Kirk, which ignited in his heart questions he had never been allowed to ask. From that moment on, a series of unimaginable events would lead him from prison to miracle, from persecution to freedom, and from Doha to the borders of the impossible. And to begin, make sure you are already subscribed, leave your like, and tell us in the comments which city or country you are watching from.
I was born in Doha, in the heart of Qatar, surrounded by everything the world calls success. My name is Abdullah Al-Rahim, and for many years I believed that life was built on duty, status, and reputation. My father was a respected government advisor, a man of wisdom and influence, and my brother Faisal held a high position in the Ministry of Interior. I grew up hearing that our family was an example of faith, discipline, and loyalty to tradition. Since childhood, every step I took was watched, every word measured. Religion was not just a system of beliefs. It was the very air we breathed. I remember the early mornings when my father would wake me before sunrise for prayer. The whole house would fill with voices whispering verses, and I would kneel repeating the words I had learned since boyhood. But even there, with my forehead pressed against the rug, something inside me felt distant. I said the right prayers, fulfilled every ritual, fasted during the appointed times, gave to the poor, everything I was taught to do to please God. And yet, in the silence of my soul, there was an emptiness that no prayer could fill. By the age of 35, I already had what many would call a perfect life. I worked as a financial director for a state-owned company in the energy sector, a position that required trust and absolute discretion. I was the kind of man everyone respected. Polite, influential, discreet, with a luxury car and an apartment in West Bay overlooking the blue sea of Doha. People saw me as the picture of stability. On the outside, I seemed to have everything. On the inside, I felt like I was slowly dying. There were days when I looked at the horizon and wondered if the God I served really heard me. Did he know how much I tried to please him? Or was it all just a sequence of gestures and words that touched no one's heart? That question haunted me like a shadow. I tried to push it away by diving into work, into prayer, into appearances. But the more I tried to silence the emptiness, the louder it screamed. It was on one of those sleepless nights that something unexpected happened. I was in the office after midnight watching a video about international politics, one of my favorite topics. I was so tired that I almost turned off the computer. But before the video ended, YouTube suggested another one, an American speaking passionately about freedom and faith. The title mentioned Charlie Kirk. I hesitated. I knew that kind of content was not welcome in my country, and if anyone saw my computer history, I could get into trouble. But something in the expression of that man caught my attention. He spoke about the power of truth, about courage, about the value of freedom. Not just political freedom, but spiritual freedom. He mentioned the name of Jesus in a way I had never heard before. Without fear, without hatred, without arrogance. Only conviction. I remember exactly the moment he said, "True freedom begins when you discover that God loves you personally." Those words struck me like lightning. Personally? I whispered to myself. That was unthinkable to me. How could God, the creator of all things, care about an ordinary man, no matter how devout he was? I closed the video, but the sentence kept echoing. The next day I watched it again. And the day after that too. Soon I found myself waiting for moments alone so I could look for more. I told myself it was just intellectual curiosity, that I wanted to understand the Western perspective. But deep down, I knew something inside me was opening. I began to find other videos, testimonies, debates, lectures. Some irritated me, others intrigued me. But all of them made me think. For the first time, I heard people talking about grace, about a relationship with God, about forgiveness and inner freedom. These were ideas I had never considered before. Over time, that curiosity turned into restlessness. I could no longer pray the same way. The words that once came automatically now felt empty. I felt as though I was reciting formulas to a distant God, while somewhere, another God, living, near, real. was silently calling me. Each video I watched intensified that feeling. It was as if a new world stood before me, but crossing into it meant destroying everything I knew. I thought about my family, my work, my reputation. I knew that questioning my faith could cost me everything. Still, I could not stop. I started watching in secret, always with headphones at the lowest volume possible. I would close the apartment curtains, turn off the lights, and open my laptop as if committing a crime. At first, I felt guilt, as if I were betraying my roots, my people, my religion. But soon the guilt gave way to something stronger, spiritual hunger. It was a hunger I could not explain, a desire to understand who this Jesus was, whom so many mentioned with tears in their eyes. I, who had always prided myself on being rational and analytical, began searching for something that could not be measured in numbers. I wanted to feel what those people felt. There was one night in particular that stayed with me. I was watching a video where Charlie Kirk was answering questions about faith at a university. A student asked, "Why should I believe in a God who allows suffering?" Charlie paused, looked at the audience, and said something that broke me. Because God does not just allow suffering, He lived it. He came into the world, felt pain, was rejected, and died to show us that love is stronger than any pain. I closed my eyes. It was as if, for the first time, I was hearing about a God who did not demand sacrifices, but who sacrificed Himself out of love. That left me speechless. I spent hours awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything I had learned since childhood. Could there really be truth outside of what I had always been told was the only truth? In the days that followed, I began to question small details, verses, rules, interpretations. At work, the numbers no longer mattered as much. At home, family prayers sounded different. I found myself repeating words that no longer made sense. And then, the crisis came. Charlie Kirk's messages left me in conflict. On one side, reason told me to stop, not to risk what I had. On the other, my heart pushed me to continue. I tried to push away the idea of Jesus, but everything around me seemed to pull me back. One morning, while reading a report, I heard a phrase echo in my mind. Not a voice, but a clear thought. The truth will set you free. It was a quote I recognized from the videos, one of the most repeated sayings of Jesus. It made me stop. I got up from the desk, walked to the window, and looked at the golden horizon of Doha. For the first time, I felt like a prisoner of myself, of expectations, of appearances, of a lifeless religion. As the months passed, the inner transformation began to show outwardly. I no longer attended family dinners as often, avoided certain conversations, and spent more time alone. My brother Faisal noticed. He had always been observant, methodical, controlling. One day he called me home to talk. He spoke in a calm but firm voice. "Abdullah, something is wrong with you. You have been acting strange. What are these videos you watch? Why do you avoid our gatherings at the mosque?" I tried to change the subject, but he insisted. He said there were rumors in the family, that some friends had commented on my Western interests. The word sounded like an accusation. I lied. I said I was just studying international economics, that the videos were about politics and freedom of speech. He looked at me in silence, with an expression that mixed suspicion and sadness. I knew I had not convinced him. After that conversation, fear settled in completely. In a country like Qatar, there are things you do not question. I knew that any misstep could put me under surveillance. Still, my curiosity was stronger than fear. It was as if something inside me whispered, "Keep going." And it was on one of those nights of conflict that everything changed. I was alone, sitting on the couch, the laptop on my lap. The video was about the love of Christ and the power of praying with sincerity. Charlie said, "If you truly want to know the truth, ask. God does not hide from those who seek Him with all their heart." I closed the computer, leaned my head into my hands, and whispered something I never thought I would say. If what I hear about Jesus is real, show me. I want the truth even if it costs me everything. At that moment, the silence in the room became profound. There was no music, no voices, no wind, only a thick peace, unlike anything I had ever felt. It was as if for a brief moment the entire world had stopped to listen to my prayer. I did not know it then, but that simple sentence, unspoken in a whisper between fear and hope, would be the turning point of my life. Because when someone dares to ask for the truth, God Himself begins to answer. And that was exactly what happened. That night, the wind began to change. It was as if the desert itself was breathing. The windows of my apartment vibrated, and a thin layer of sand slipped through every crack, covering the floor with a golden hue. I was alone, just me, the distant sound of the wind, and the weight of a heart that could no longer find peace. I had prayed only a few hours earlier, one of those prayers that are not planned, that simply escape when the soul reaches its limit. I had asked for the truth, no matter the cost. Little did I know that truth was about to find me in a way I would never be able to explain in words. The power went out suddenly. The city of Doha, always so bright, plunged into deep silence, broken only by the roar of the storm. I pulled the curtain aside and looked outside. The horizon had disappeared. There was only sand, wind, and darkness. And then I saw it. A light, soft and unlike anything I had ever seen, passed through the window glass and filled the room. It was not lightning, not fire, not a reflection from a car. It was something alive, pulsing, almost breathing. It did not flicker or tremble. It was constant, warm, enveloping. My whole body froze. I felt my heart race, but there was no fear, only an uncontrollable reverence. And then in the middle of that silence that felt eternal, I heard a voice. It did not come from outside. It came from within and from every direction at once. A calm, firm, and indescribably loving voice. Abdullah, I have called you by name. I am the way you have been searching for. Those words pierced through everything, mind, flesh, and soul. I fell to my knees without thinking, without understanding. Tears began to stream down my face and I could not stop them. A warmth filled my body, but it was not physical. It was as if the emptiness that had followed me for years was being torn out, and something completely new, pure and alive was being placed in its place. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. Only sobs, breath, and tears. For a few seconds, maybe minutes, maybe an eternity, everything was suspended. There was no time, no fear, no pain, only peace, a peace so real it felt tangible. I felt as if I were being held by something unseen, as if hands were lifting me from the ground. That room, which once felt cold, was now the warmest and safest place in the world. And then, just as it had appeared, the light began to fade slowly, until only the faint glow of the storm outside remained. I stayed there, kneeling, breathing slowly, trying to understand what had just happened. It was as if I had been touched by something not of this world. And within me, one certainty. I was no longer alone. In the days that followed, I could hardly sleep. The scene replayed in my mind like a film. The words I heard would not leave my heart. I am the way you have been searching for. I knew who had spoken those words. Even though I had never seen him before, I knew. It was Jesus, and that simple truth was enough to turn my life upside down. I spent the first 48 hours trying to rationalize it. Maybe it had been a dream. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it was a hallucination caused by the storm. But every logical explanation crumbled when I remembered the feeling of peace, a peace that cannot be invented, that cannot be fabricated. I, who had always needed proof, was now faced with something that reason could not measure, but the heart recognized as true. On the fourth day, I decided to research. I typed into my computer with trembling hands, "Jesus appears in dreams," and what I found took my breath away. Hundreds of testimonies from men and women in the Middle East, Muslims like me, who said they had seen the same light, heard the same voice, felt the same warmth that transforms fear into love. It was as if, beyond borders, someone was weaving together similar stories, connecting people who would never meet but who shared one thing in common, an encounter with Christ. Each video, each testimony, was a mirror of what I had lived. I spent hours watching, eyes filled with tears, trying to understand why me. Why at that moment, in that place? And the more I watched, the more I understood. He had heard me. That whispered prayer, "True God, if what I hear about Jesus is real, show me," had crossed the desert and the silence all the way to the throne of God. On the outside, I looked the same. Tailored suit, flawless routine, financial reports delivered on time. But inside, something was being born. I woke up early just to feel again the presence of that night. I began to notice simple things. The sunrise reflecting off the buildings of Doha, the distant sound of the call to prayer. Everything seemed different, as if life had gained colors I had never seen before. But still, there was something I needed to do. Understand more. Read, listen, seek. And it was in that pursuit that the true miracle happened. A few weeks later, I was on my way to work. I got into the company car. The same driver as always, Joseph Fernandez. A quiet, kind Filipino who had worked with us for years. He had always been respectful but reserved. He rarely spoke, only listened to soft music on the radio that I did not recognize. That day, something different happened. As he parked, Joseph dropped his phone between the seats. I leaned down to pick it up, and when the screen lit up, I froze. A phrase appeared in clear letters. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." For a second, the world seemed to stop. He looked at me, startled, as if he had been caught doing something forbidden. I held the phone and asked in a low voice, trying not to show emotion, "That verse, do you believe it?" He stayed silent. Then he answered, almost whispering, "Yes, Mr. Abdullah, I do." "And you believe in him too, don't you?" I do not know how he knew. Maybe he saw it in my eyes. Maybe it was discernment. But in that instant, we did not need words. That look alone was enough for an invisible bridge to form between us. For the first time, I felt understood, not as someone curious, but as someone who had been touched by the same love. Joseph took a deep breath and looked around, making sure we were alone. Then he said something that changed the direction of my life. "Sir, there are people here in Doha who meet in secret. Christians. They pray, sing, and study the Bible together. It is dangerous, but it is real. If you want, I can take you." My heart pounded. I knew the risk I was taking. Just hearing that was already crossing lines that could cost me my freedom. But something inside me shouted that I had to go. A few days later, on a silent night, Joseph came by with the car and took me to a distant neighborhood, almost at the edge of the desert. The building was simple, discreet, with no signs, no markings. We climbed a narrow staircase, and when the door opened, I was greeted by the soft sound of voices singing quietly. There were about 10 people there, men and women from different countries, Filipinos, Indians, Lebanese, all gathered around a small wooden table. In the center there was an open book, the Bible. When I walked in, everyone smiled, as if they had been expecting me. No one asked my real name. They simply said, "Welcome, brother." That word, brother, echoed inside me like a promise. I sat down, trying to hide my nervousness. One of the men began reading aloud, in Arabic. I held my breath. It was the first time in my life that I heard the Bible in my own language. The words seemed to come alive. It was as if every phrase had been written for me. "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." I could not hold back my tears. It felt as though Jesus was speaking directly to me again. The prayers that followed were simple but full of power. No one there was trying to impress. There were no memorized repetitions, only hearts laid bare before a God who was not distant but present. When that gathering ended, I felt reborn. That small group of humble people, foreign workers living in fear of being discovered, showed me what true faith was. They had no temples, no microphones, no security, only love, courage, and an unshakable certainty that God was there. Joseph handed me a Bible translated into Arabic. I held it as one holds a treasure. That night, when I opened the first page, I saw a handwritten dedication for the one who sought the truth and was found by the truth. I did not sleep. I read for hours. Every word seemed to fit into the questions I had always carried. The stories, the psalms, the letters. Everything made sense. It was as if someone had finally turned on the light in a room where I had lived in darkness my entire life. And it was there, in that small apartment hidden among the buildings of Doha, that I realized the miracle was not just the light that appeared in my home. The miracle was that encounter itself. It was the way God used a video on the internet, an unknown driver, and a group of unlikely people to show me that he was alive, active, and calling me by name. From that night on, nothing would ever be the same. The man who walked into that room in silence walked out transformed. I still did not know what would come next, the consequences, the risks, the pain, but there was something inside me that no authority, no law, no fear could ever extinguish. Something had awakened, something that told me that this story was only beginning. Months passed, and my life was divided into two worlds, two faces, two voices, two hearts beating in opposite rhythms. By day, I was the same Abdullah as always, the exemplary employee, the man in the perfectly pressed suit, respected by superiors, feared by subordinates. I fulfilled my duties, prayed at the right times, said the words people expected of me. But at night I became another man. The silence of Doha's streets was my refuge. At every secret gathering with the small group of foreign Christians, I felt as though I could finally breathe. We read the Bible with the windows closed, whispered our prayers, exchanged looks of courage. I was afraid, yes, but that fear was mixed with something new, a sense of freedom that no position, no title, and no human power had ever given me. It was like living a miracle in secret. But the heart of someone who carries two lives never rests. As my faith grew, the danger grew with it. I began to notice strange looks at work, subtle questions in the hallways, whispered comments in meetings. And somehow, I knew. The time of hiding was running out. One night, during a meeting in my apartment, a chill ran through my body. We were reading the Gospel of John when the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Everything went silent. We turned off the lights, held our breath. But nothing happened. After a few minutes, we prayed again, trying to ignore the feeling that something had changed. The next day, Joseph Fernandez, the driver who had become my brother in faith, did not show up. I called his phone several times and no one answered. By the end of the day, the phone was turned off. I knew what that meant. In Qatar, people simply disappear when they cross certain lines, and Joseph had crossed them all for me. That same day, I received a message from my brother Faisal asking me to come to the ministry immediately. I remember every detail, the cold air conditioning, the sound of my footsteps echoing down the hallway, my heart beating so hard it felt like it would expose everything. He was there, sitting behind his desk, with the cold look of someone who already knew what had to be said. "Abdullah," he began, his voice tense. "They know." My whole body froze. He continued. "There is evidence, reports, testimonies. You were seen with foreigners, illegal meetings, and Joseph has disappeared." My first impulse was to deny it, but something inside me refused to lie. Instead, I stayed silent. He stood up, walked toward me and said, his face just inches from mine, "You have 24 hours. Either you publicly recant or you will be handed over to the religious authorities." That sentence sounded like a verdict. I tried to argue, to explain, to say that none of this was a threat to the country, that I was still the same brother he had always known. But Faisal did not want to listen. His eyes were not filled with hatred. They were filled with shame, shame for having a brother who, in the eyes of society, had betrayed his faith, his family, and the name we had carried for generations. When I realized my words would have no effect, I simply said, "Faisal, I found the truth, and it set me free." He turned away, furious. The door slammed shut, and in that instant I knew the bridge between us had been burned. That same night I was expelled from home. My mother cried in silence, unable to look me in the eyes. My belongings were placed in a suitcase and left on the sidewalk. I, who had always had everything, now had nothing. Nothing but a newborn faith and a certainty in my heart. The God who had found me in the storm would not abandon me now. But the price of truth had only begun to be demanded. A few days later, I woke up to the sound of a hard knock on the door. A group of men entered. Their faces were covered, their voices firm. "Abdullah Al-Rahim, you're coming with us." I did not resist. I was taken blindfolded, my hands bound. The car drove for hours before stopping in what seemed like a remote place. The air was hot and dry. and the smell of sand filled the fabric that covered my face. I was interrogated for hours. The questions were always the same. Who do you meet with? Who influenced you? Do you still believe in Jesus? I answered calmly, I believe. Each time I said it, I felt the tension rise. 3 days passed. 3 days during which I lost all sense of time, not knowing whether it was night or day. Sometimes I heard footsteps, low voices, the sound of iron doors opening. At times, I thought it would be the end. But even there, something inside me remained calm. It was as if the same voice from that night was still with me, saying, I am here. At dawn on the 4th day, they took me out of the cell. The sun was rising, and for the first time, I could see the faces of my captors. They were armed men, serious, silent. One of them pushed me into a military vehicle. The trip was long, and little by little I realized where we were going. The same desert where everything had begun. We arrived at an isolated spot, with no buildings, no roads, only dunes and the sound of the wind. They ordered me to get out. One of the men, his expression unreadable, announced the sentence, "Death for apostasy." I knelt down. My hands were tied, the hot sand burning my knees. The sun glared off the weapons pointed at me. My body trembled, but not from fear, from emotion, because at that moment I understood something I never had before. True faith is not proven when everything is fine. It is proven when there is no way out. I closed my eyes and prayed. Not for myself, but for them. Lord Jesus, if there is still purpose in my life, save me. Not for me, but so that your name may be known. When I finished the prayer, something unexplainable happened. A gust of wind blew with a force that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth. The sand lifted so violently that visibility disappeared completely. The soldiers began shouting, trying to shield themselves. I felt the wind push my body backward, almost knocking me down. The sound was deafening. The storm lasted minutes, or maybe seconds, I do not know. When the wind finally ceased, silence took over. I slowly opened my eyes. The dunes looked different, as if the desert itself had changed shape. And the soldiers were gone. For a moment I thought I had lost my mind. I looked around, trying to understand. Then I saw a silhouette approaching between the dunes. A man walked toward me, his uniform covered in sand. It was Yusuf Karim, the same guard who had escorted me since prison. He approached with steady steps, looked around and said, breathless, "Go. The cameras are off. There is a car waiting. God sent me to free you." I could not respond. I just stared at him, trying to comprehend. God sent me to free you. Those words echoed inside me like the continuation of the voice I had heard months before. Yusuf untied me with his own hands, handed me a bottle of water, and pointed toward the horizon. "Go that way. When the sun sets, you will see a road. Someone will be waiting for you." Still confused, I asked, "Why are you doing this?" He answered with a faint smile, "Because a long time ago I prayed the same prayer you did." And he heard me. We stood in silence for a few seconds. I wanted to embrace him, but he stepped back and said, "Go now, before it is too late." I ran. I ran with all my strength. The wind hit my face, the sand cut my feet, but my heart pounded with a power I had never felt before. With every step, it was as if I could hear one phrase inside me. "I have called you by name." That night marked the beginning of a new escape. Not from death, but from the old life. The storm that surrounded me had not been destruction. It was deliverance. And even without understanding everything, I knew. The same God who had found me in the desert had just saved me there once again. I remember the silence of the desert that dawn. After the storm, I walked for hours without knowing where to go. The sand still cut my face, my body was exhausted, and every step felt like the last. Then I saw a faint light flickering in the distance. A campfire. I approached with what little strength I had left and found an old Bedouin with a white beard and kind eyes. His name was Abbas Rahman. He offered me water, bread, and shelter without asking any questions. Only later, when I noticed the small cross hanging from his neck, did I realize he too was a follower of Christ. That simple man living among the dunes risked his own life to help me. For days we traveled together toward the border. He recited passages from the Bible he knew by heart, and I felt as though every word renewed my soul. When I finally reached Jordan, I fell to my knees and wept. It was not just political freedom I had found. It was spiritual freedom. Months later, I arrived in Canada, where I was granted asylum. There, I found a new spiritual family, men and women from many nations, all united by the same faith that had transformed my life. For the first time, I could read the Bible in public without fear, without hiding. With each verse, I felt as though God was rewriting my story. Today, when I speak at conferences, I always say, the greatest prison I faced was not made of walls or weapons. It was the fear within me. And it was Jesus who freed me from that invisible prison. But the miracle did not end there. Years later, I received a message that made my heart stop for a moment. It was a handwritten letter from Qatar. The handwriting was familiar. It was from my mother, Amina. She wrote that after my departure, she had found a Bible hidden among my belongings and had begun reading it in secret. The words of Jesus had touched her deeply. "My son," she wrote, "I too want to know this God who saved you." In that moment, I understood that the transformation God begins in one life can cross borders, oceans, and even hearts that once seemed unreachable. My story is a living reminder that no one is beyond the reach of grace. God used a video on the internet, a Filipino driver, and a desert storm to find me. When everything said, "It is impossible," the Spirit of God whispered, "Nothing is impossible for me." Today, every time I share what I lived, I do not speak of courage, I speak of mercy, because if the love of God could reach me in the midst of the driest desert, it can also reach anyone who is lost in silence, asking for a sign. Faith did not just save me. It reignited a flame that continues to light lives even in the places where hope once seemed extinguished.
And so ends the testimony of Abdullah Al-Rahim, a man who crossed the desert of persecution to find true freedom, not the kind that comes from men, but the kind that comes from God. His story shows us that when everything seems lost, heaven still has a plan. The same God who freed him from the prison of fear is still at work today, freeing hearts and igniting faith where there was only silence. If you made it this far, it is because this message has also touched your heart. So, make sure you are subscribed to the channel, leave your like, and write in the comments, "I love Jesus," so that the world will know there are still hearts burning with faith. And get ready, because the next video appearing on your screen will move you deeply. You will hear the story of a group of Christians who were buried alive for their faith, but God intervened and performed a miracle. Click now and discover the power that unfolds when faith becomes greater than fear.